What Canada has done has Donald Trump fuming with anger in his Oval Office. That's because instead of receiving a phone call from Justin Trudeau for a request, he has found out that Canada is replacing the United States for its oil exports. Until now, Canada exported 97% of its oil to the United States, meaning the American energy sector is highly and structurally dependent on Canadian oil. But what if Canada cut off oil exports to the United States? In return for the tariffs, Justin Trudeau has now decided to go offensive and make Donald Trump feel the pain. And he is doing so by allying with forces that Trump has resented recently. Yes, Trudeau has decided to replace the United States with the EU for its oil exports, taking the tariff war to a whole new level. So, what can happen if Canada cuts its oil exports to the United States and sends all of it to the EU? How will the American energy sector be in tatters? In this video, let's know about the whole story. For decades, Canada has been America's most reliable oil supplier, quietly providing 60% of U.S. crude imports without much leverage in return. The relationship was always one-sided. Washington dictated trade terms, pipelines flowed southward, and Canadian oil was sold at a discount to American refiners. But now, the tables are turning. With Trump threatening a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, Canada is no longer playing nice. The frustration is boiling over, and for the first time in history, Ottawa is considering hitting back where it hurts most. And that is America's energy supply. This isn't just about a short-term trade war. This is Canada taking control of its own energy destiny, ensuring that no U.S. administration can ever again weaponize trade policies against it. And the first step is breaking free from America's oil stranglehold and turning towards Europe. At first glance, the idea of shutting down the flow of oil seems highly complex, even risky. The infrastructure of Canada's oil industry was designed decades ago to feed U.S. refineries, making the U.S. the default market for Canadian crude. The network of pipelines, trade agreements, and deep economic integration between the two nations has made energy cooperation almost second nature. Any major disruption to this supply chain would send shockwaves through both economies. But here is what Washington refuses to acknowledge. The United States is far more dependent on Canadian oil than Canada is on the U.S. as a customer. If Ottawa decides to impose export restrictions, introduce tariffs, or completely halt shipments, the consequences for the U.S. economy will be devastating. While Canada would face short-term disruptions, it has the potential to redirect its oil to Europe and Asia, markets that are desperately seeking stable democratic energy suppliers. Meanwhile, the U.S. would find itself scrambling to secure alternative sources, which are either too expensive, politically complicated, or outright unavailable. One of the biggest reasons why Canada holds immense leverage is that U.S. refineries are built specifically to process heavy crude oil, the type that Canada produces in abundance. While the U.S. does produce large amounts of oil, much of it is light shale oil, which many American refineries are not designed to refine efficiently. In the past, U.S. refineries depended on a mix of heavy crude from Venezuela and Canada. But after Venezuela's oil industry collapsed and Washington imposed sanctions, American refineries became almost entirely reliant on Canadian oil sands to maintain production. If Canada were to halt or slow down exports, U.S. refineries could not simply switch to processing light shale oil overnight. Retrofitting these refineries to handle a different type of crude would require billions of dollars in investment and take years to complete. Without Canadian crude, many refineries would be forced to shut down or drastically cut production, leading to nationwide fuel shortages and skyrocketing gas prices. Furthermore, what many people don't realize is that the U.S. does not just consume Canadian oil, it profits from it. Once crude oil from Canada reaches U.S. refineries, it is processed into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other refined petroleum products. These products are then sold to consumers at home and exported to international markets under the label of American-made energy. A significant portion of this refined fuel is even sold back to Canada at a higher price. This means that American oil companies are not just dependent on Canadian oil to fuel their own economy. They have built an entire industry around repackaging and exporting it as a high-value commodity. If Canada were to reduce or halt exports, it would not only impact U.S. consumers but also cripple the refining industry, causing massive job losses, supply chain disruptions, and financial disruption for major oil corporations that rely on cheap Canadian crude. If Canada slows or stops oil exports, the U.S. will be forced to seek alternative suppliers, but viable replacements do not exist. Venezuela, once a major heavy crude supplier, is no longer an option due to political instability and U.S. sanctions. Even if Trump lifted these sanctions, Venezuela's oil production has collapsed so severely that it would take years to rebuild. On top of that, Trump is unlikely to risk alienating Florida's influential Venezuelan exile community by appearing to soften his stance on Maduro's government. Mexico, another traditional supplier, is also not a reliable option, as it has prioritized domestic refining and is keeping more of its oil for itself under its energy security strategy. Other major producers, like Russia and Iran, are heavily sanctioned, making it nearly impossible for American companies to purchase their oil. Even if Trump lifted restrictions on Russian crude, the political fallout would be enormous. Iran, meanwhile, remains a geopolitical adversary, making it an extremely unlikely candidate for replacing Canadian crude. With no easy alternatives, the U.S. would be left in an energy crisis, scrambling to secure crude from sources that are either too expensive or politically off-limits. Beyond the refining and export industry, Canadian oil is deeply integrated into the U.S. economy, particularly in states that are geographically dependent on this supply. The Midwest and Rocky Mountain states rely almost entirely on Canadian oil for their gasoline production. These states do not have direct access to seaborne oil imports, meaning that if Canada halts or taxes oil exports, fuel shortages in these regions could become a political crisis for Trump, especially with the 2026 midterms approaching. Refineries in states like Michigan, Ohio, and North Dakota are directly connected to Canada's pipeline system. Without this oil, they would have no immediate alternatives, creating economic instability that would ripple across the country. This situation would leave Trump and his administration in an incredibly vulnerable position. This makes it apparent that Canada holds the winning cards. Although Canada has historically been heavily reliant on the U.S. as a buyer, the reality is that the U.S. has far more to lose if this relationship changes. If Canada slows exports, the U.S. has no short-term replacement for its oil needs. If Canada imposes an export tax, Ottawa could generate tens of billions in additional revenue while forcing Washington to back down on tariffs. However, Canada has a far better option. That is to redirect its oil exports to Europe, strengthening its economic position globally, while reducing dependence on an increasingly unpredictable and protectionist U.S. administration. With European nations desperately seeking to replace Russian oil, Canada has a golden opportunity to emerge as a key energy supplier to the EU. European leaders have already expressed interest in securing a stable, democratic alternative to Russian energy, and Canada could fill this role while earning premium prices for its oil. This would allow Canada to expand its economic influence on the global stage while ensuring that its oil resources are not subject to the whims of American politics. Meanwhile, the U.S. would be left in a state of panic, unable to find a short-term replacement for the 4 million barrels of oil it receives from Canada each day. By leveraging its energy dominance, Canada has the power to force Trump to rethink his aggressive trade policies. The time has come for Ottawa to stop playing the role of America's junior partner and take decisive action to secure its own economic future. If Trump insists on using tariffs as a weapon against Canada, then Canada must respond with its own economic countermeasures. Before we continue further, tell us, are you enjoying the video? If yes, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, and current affairs impacting your lives. Canada has to understand that the US has taken Canada's energy for granted, treating it as a cheap and automatic resource pipeline. Meanwhile, Europe is in desperate need of a stable and reliable oil and gas supplier. The European Union, after cutting off Russian energy imports, is facing one of its worst energy shortages in decades. With Canada's vast oil reserves, commitment to environmental standards, and a stable political system, it is the perfect alternative to unreliable and geopolitically risky suppliers. This shift is more than just speculation. Canada is actively working on reshaping its oil exports to bypass the US and serve the European market directly. This would mean less reliance on an increasingly hostile US trade policy and the opportunity to sell oil at fair market prices rather than at the discount Canada is forced to accept from American buyers. One of the biggest breakthroughs in Canada's energy diversification is the Trans Mountain expansion. This newly expanded pipeline connects Alberta's oil sands directly to the Pacific coast, enabling Canada to export its crude oil to global markets, including Europe and Asia, rather than relying solely on the US. This is Canada's first major step toward breaking its dependence on American buyers and signals to the world that Canada is ready to become an independent energy superpower. Another major consideration is the revival of the Energy East pipeline, a long-abandoned project that would allow Canadian crude oil to flow from Alberta to the East Coast, where it could be exported directly to Europe. The US has proven itself to be an unreliable trade partner, repeatedly weaponizing tariffs and economic policies against Canada. This has forced Ottawa to reconsider the Energy East project, which, if completed, would completely change Canada's energy trade landscape and give Europe direct access to Canadian oil without US interference. Beyond pipelines, Canada is also exploring alternative export routes that bypass US dependence entirely. One such opportunity is the Lobito Corridor, a strategic rail link running from Angola to the Atlantic Ocean, originally intended for the African minerals trade. However, with shifting energy priorities, Canada could potentially leverage this corridor as a new trade route to supply oil and energy products to European nations. If this happens, Canada would not only lessen its reliance on the US, but also establish stronger economic ties with Europe, further solidifying its energy independence. Financially, this shift could be a goldmine for Canada. If even half of the crude oil currently sent to the US were redirected to Europe, Canada could generate tens of billions in additional revenue every year. Unlike American buyers who demand discounted rates, Europe is actively seeking stable, democratic, and environmentally responsible energy sources, and is willing to pay market value for them. This would not only boost Canada's economy, but also reduce its vulnerability to US economic manipulation. With these developments, Canada is sending a clear message to the world that it no longer needs the US to survive, and it is more than capable of thriving on its own. Even though Donald Trump has repeatedly claimed that America does not need Canadian oil, the reality tells a different story. The entire US refining system was built around Canadian crude, meaning that any disruption in supply could lead to massive fuel shortages and skyrocketing gas prices. For decades, the US has structured its energy policies around the assumption that Canadian oil will always be available. Now Canada is considering using that very assumption as a bargaining chip. If Canada imposes an export tax on crude oil, even a 15% tax could generate $25 billion annually, while making it more expensive for US buyers to rely on Canadian crude. This would create a major political crisis for Trump, as gas prices are one of the most sensitive economic indicators for American voters. Historical data shows that every 10-cent increase in gas prices reduces a U.S. president's approval rating by approximately 0.6%. With Trump's thin congressional majority and the looming 2026 midterms, he cannot afford a gas price crisis, especially one that could have been avoided if he had not provoked Canada with trade wars. Interestingly, Canada's leverage over the U.S. does not stop at oil. The world is rapidly transitioning toward electric vehicles, advanced semiconductors, and renewable energy, all of which require critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. Canada is one of the few Western nations with vast reserves of these minerals, making it an essential player in the future global economy. If Ottawa wanted to apply even more pressure on Washington, it could completely cut the U.S. out of its mineral exports, redirecting supplies exclusively to Europe and China. This would leave American industries scrambling for new sources, as these minerals are essential for manufacturing electric vehicle batteries, military equipment, and high-tech products. Canada could also use its monopoly over these resources to force Trump to drop tariffs. That's because, without Canadian critical minerals, the U.S. cannot build a competitive EV industry. Additionally, a strategic minerals alliance with the EU would allow Canada to integrate its economy more closely with Europe while sidelining the U.S. By focusing on both oil and minerals, Canada is not just retaliating against U.S. trade policies. It is also laying the foundation for long-term economic independence from Washington's influence. Now, for the first time in history, Canada holds the upper hand in its trade relationship with the U.S. Decades of dependence and economic submission are coming to an end, and Canada is in a position to completely rewrite the rules of its energy and trade policies. If Ottawa plays its cards right, it can permanently shift oil exports away from the U.S. and establish Europe as its primary buyer. It can also use its control over critical minerals to force Washington into economic concessions. This is a historic turning point for Canada. The world is watching, and Ottawa has a choice to make. It's to be seen whether Canada will seize this unprecedented opportunity to establish itself as an energy and mineral superpower, or will it once again allow itself to be overshadowed by American interests? If Canada truly wants to break free from Washington's grip, the time to act is now. What do you think? Can Canada totally replace the United States with the EU? Or will Trump ensure Canada is never in a position to make such a turn that can leave the American energy sector in turmoil? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on what if Canada joins the EU and becomes the main supplier of oil and gas to Europe? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We bring the latest news stories on geopolitics, economics, changing world order, and current affairs, things you need to stay informed. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.